you bought
I
one.
was going to, but the
I have,
line was too long.
I have a copy for each of you. I'll go
Really?
back.
Oh,
and-
That's
that's so
fantastic.
nice.
He's got a
Thank you
whole
very
bag,
much.
right, Chuck?
Yeah,
Full metal
for all
bag.
of you.
And we want, you to sign it and everything.
Okay.
So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tigran Haas, and I'm the director of the Center for the Future of Places and also an associate professor of urban planning and design. And you are listening to the Delphi Conversations, discussions and conversations about urbanism. And today I'm very fortunate to have four luminaries from the United States here to discuss interesting issues of urbanism, and I would like them to introduce themselves.
Daniel Solomon, architect and urban designer, partner in Methuen-Solomon, professor emeritus, UC Berkeley.
Emily Talen, professor of urbanism at the University of Chicago in Chicago, Illinois.
Susan Silberberg. I'm a city planner, urban designer, author, and educator. I'm the founder of Civic Moxie, an urban planning group, and have been a part-time lecturer at MIT.
And I'm Chuck Wolfe from Seattle, Washington, United States of America. I have my own law firm in Seattle. I am also the author of 2 books on urbanism from Island Press, and I'm an affiliate associate professor of urban design and planning at the University of Washington in Seattle.
Writer. So, welcome everybody. The idea is that we're going to talk about urbanism in general, but there are specific topics we're going to sort of get deeper into. And even if the conversations are called Delphi Conversations, I don't think we're going to get to the final truths. I'm not sure. I wonder how Delphi Oracle functioned and how long it took, but we can maybe try to get a little bit of that. And some of the topics we're going to discuss today, they're going to circle around design for social diversity, the role of public space, especially again in social diversity and creating equity, social housing, the art of placemaking, and finally we're going to talk about how do we see and observe the city, the difference between observational urbanism and doing research in the city using different techniques. So there's a lot of subjects we're going to cover, but I think we're going to have a very interesting floating discussion. So, and I was just passing around an article by a very famous, unfortunately late sociologist Nathan Glazer, who wrote a book of essays on the city. And one of the essays was called "What Happened to the Social Agenda?" And he was referring to the modernists that he actually praised for having a social agenda when they were building housing and thinking about people. And as opposed to the new, as Professor Doug Kelbo would call them, post-urbanists or starchitects that actually don't have any kind of a social agenda. They're just building for this extraordinary looks in the city and sort of creating arts instead of social things. So I'm going to turn to you, Dan, because I know you have been involved in the social housing program Hope 6 for a number of years, and you have, with a number of colleagues, have been very, very successful to bring the social agenda back into the urban design. So just your reflection on
what happened to the
it?
social agenda? Well, it graduated from architecture school, and went on to other things. So and left architecture school holding a very empty bag. I think that an empty bag of formalist preoccupations and personal narratives. I think that this unfortunate matriculation of the social agenda out of schools of architecture and planning has left the physical without its moral and intellectual force.
But then at the same time, in urban planning, it became more, all social and sort of divorced from the urban design side. So we had this sort of parting of the seas with 2 camps on either side. And it seemed under modernist urbanism, those things were all integrated, but it failed badly. The social agenda was mishandled, let's say. And so maybe that's sort of the root cause of this sort of parting. And I think in new urbanism, there's been an attempt to bring it all back together.
It's interesting because I think that when we talk about this in theory, it's very different than when it's practice. And it's been interesting to take my teaching and work at MIT, put it into my firm, and look at how does it play out on the ground. Because it's not only about the architects and the designers or the planners, but it's also really about how do we work within the structure of our cities, of government, of finance, and all of the things that really force us to think about how to be expedient, how to be efficient. Projects have time limits, they have costs associated with them, and then the pressures of making sure that all of these things are addressed within that environment, I think are very, very difficult. And as a result, the social agenda often drops out.
I'll say our seating chart is perfect because we're going down to the trenches now. But
From where?
From where?
From the exalted one.
from the cloud. No.
Yeah.
As I'm a practicing lawyer who's done a lot of writing about cities. I have a planning background. My father was a planning professor, so I'm a mixture of osmosis and practitioner. And where I have seen what we've all been talking about come into play is in a very rapidly changing urban environment in my hometown of Seattle, which essentially replicates what is happening in high demand inner cities around the world now that we've moved back to the city under the creative class moniker. And so what I see is not only from an academic perspective, but so many people who advocated for the Back to the City movement are understanding that there were social costs associated with that. And I think the social agenda has returned starkly to people as they see their cities changing, people being priced out, people who control change being generally those who have the resources to build. And one thing that's encouraging to me is that at least in left-minded cities, people are finding new ways to facilitate the voices that are feeling left out. And I think that's some of what Susan might have been alluding to. So 3 out of the 4 of us just came from CNU in Seattle, and I saw CNU actually looking very, very hard at the equity issues and the empowerment issues. And
Which is sort of a paradigm shift in
right,
CNU, right?
yeah,
A
so
little bit.
a bit, a bit.
It was center stage. I was surprised
yeah,
at
it
how
was-
forceful
yeah,
it was.
yeah, it
And I
was-
think it makes the architects among us uncomfortable, frankly.
Oh, I beg your pardon.
Yeah.
Maybe not you, but there has been this
Yeah.
tension, even in CNU,
Right.
between the architecture side and
Right.
the social agenda side.
You're absolutely right. And I think that your parting of the seas metaphor is very apt and very unfortunate. And the CNU's original vision was of a very sophisticated knowledge of city form and its social importance. And the schism, which has been a schism since Berkeley in the 60s, when I started teaching there in 1966, social people were people who despised architecture, and architects were thought of people who despised people, and that if you liked one, you couldn't possibly have any sympathy for the other. And that ridiculous schism has perpetuated itself and reemerged in almost the same language
Yeah,
as
exactly.
40 or 50
Yeah.
years ago.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I remember my dad was an urban designer. He was from the physical side, and he, as a department founder, found himself under attack in the 60s, based on the same forces that Dan just described. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I've been thinking, oh my God, these are the conversations of my youth when my dad would, and I don't, maybe I digress, but a lot of it has stemmed from the political forces we see afoot these days as well. You see what we call now the resistance in the United States, almost bringing these issues back in a way we haven't seen for years.
Right.
Because
But in a way that has left the most talented designers and people concerned with the physical have marginalized themselves
right.
out of the equation.
All of this really matters when you actually are in a community. You're kind of taking what happens at conferences, what happens when we write a book, when we do our research, when we teach. Then we work in communities. I like to think of we don't work for communities, we work in communities. And that's where it really matters. I think that some of the arguments that we have, kind of at this higher level, when we come down to whatever you want to call it, placemaking, planning, those don't matter. It becomes an issue of trust. It becomes an issue of what has happened before or not happened before. And how can you change the conversation at the local level? It's an interesting translation of what does it look like?
The people amongst whom there's no controversy about the importance of the physical for the social are the people who have been left in public housing, rotting public housing for the last 60 or 70 years, and who've experienced the failure of modern movement's hubris. When we work in public housing projects, there's no difficulty in explaining to residents of public housing that physical design is absolutely important for their lives.
But this is something which comes out of Nathan's argumentation here, that after 60 years of failed public housing, the new architects just felt, we're not going to get into this because probably we're going to get into another type of failure. So we're going to keep out of the social agenda. But then in the Hope 6 program, you have accomplished that. Those of you that worked, as I know it was you and it was Stefanos Polizoidis and Peter Calthorpe and many others.
Well, there's a great deal more than simply Hope 6. There's a very powerful movement of nonprofit housing providers operating on a very narrow, very tenuous string of low-income housing tax credits and a very tiny stream of money that have made enormous accomplishments, during the last 20 years.
Right.
Yeah.
And what you mentioned with the community, we'll come back to that in relation to placemaking, but in your book, which I have here, Urban Design Reclaimed, in the introduction, I think you talk about two types of urban design. One is the architectural-driven grand urban design. The second one is the community-based one. So there's like these two different...
Well, this was my attempt to, urban planners, most of what they do has design implications, especially something like zoning, which has really been their bread and butter. I worked for the city of Santa Barbara for 6 years, and it was all about the rules and regulations there. But planners have not really engaged with what are the urban design implications of that kind of work. So this was my attempt to try to come up with exercises that they could do that involved GIS, which planners are very comfortable with. And now, of course, I feel that SketchUp has been a real boon for urban planners to be able to start visualizing, the design implications of things.
And Google Earth.
And Google Earth.
Yeah.
Google Earth. Yeah. So, I wanted to ask Susan something related to what you said before about when we get into the real world, maybe these divisions don't matter as much, maybe was your point. But I feel like the debates that go on in Chicago in community engagement kind of settings, they're all about this tension, the gentrification, the displacement, we're actually against TOD, transit-oriented development, because it's taking away our affordable housing. I feel like in the trenches, I see this kind of social versus design, walkability versus affordable housing. That is just a palpable tension going on all the time. Maybe that wasn't really your point.
Well, there is a tension. I just don't think that it is framed as a design or planning or social. I think that it tends to be framed as others have done this to us.
Right.
And so and so it takes a lot of community discussion to pull apart what is the part of what has been done to us, because it all tends to get lumped together, and it makes it very difficult to affect positive change because no one really understands what part of it might be good.
Right.
And so that's the part that
I
I just think
see.
that conversation up here isn't what happens.
I'm very excited over here because I absolutely agree with both of you, and I'm.
We are so glad to hear it.
Yeah, no. The reason is because the way I would phrase your clarification is, it's become expressed through identity politics, and it is very difficult to get things done to achieve the ends that Dan is alluding to, the complex ends and the complex processes that sometimes are necessary to achieve a true sense of equity in a design, whether it's physical or social or both. When people are just pointing fingers at each other and saying yes, no.
Right.
I mean, the way I like to phrase it is we're in the era where you're either a NIMBY, not in my backyard, or a YIMBY, yes, in my backyard. I've been doing a lot of work to try, both in my recent book and when I'm out there practicing, to try and get to that middle ground where people actually talk to each other, and you can get cute about it, you can get kumbaya about it and call it a safe place.
Right.
But
Right.
some of the best ideas about getting to that community dialogue has come from developer friends of mine and developer contacts rather than planners.
Right.
I've watched planners try still to engage in a way that appears to be facilitating, but it's really quite directive in the sense of I'm a big which is strange, I'm a big visual person as a lawyer, but for instance, I know one major American city where community involvement having to do with design guidelines, having to do with upzones that are aimed at exacting monies for affordable housing, that community involvement is still the old visual preference survey.
Would you rather have a tree or a parking lot?
Exactly. But now it's a little more sophisticated. Now people in government have realized, people don't come to meetings anymore, or we always get the same people at meetings.
Right.
Let's let people go online in their spare time and have a virtual meeting. Okay. So to that end, it's like, go to our Flickr page and pick this. Which do you like better, this or that? And I've seen a lot of our public involvement fail because it's still too directive, and there are not yet meaningful ways implemented often for people to participate. Technology is giving us new opportunities, but I think that's the biggest challenge. I mean, you guys are free to disagree with me, but in seeing that I'm out there advocating, and I'm also out there thinking about how to achieve good results for hopefully everybody, but sometimes it's a client-based thing. It's like, how do we meaningfully engage people who are in the identity politics game of saying, you live in a single-family home, those shouldn't even exist anymore, and all zoning had a racist precept to it, which it may well have. But those are the conversations that we get caught up in.
I may have a slightly Pollyanna-ish view of this because I live in a city, San Francisco, which is the most progressive city anywhere,
I thought
where there are intermittent successes.
Right.
And the successes, I think, are directed engagement. And I don't think there's anything wrong with directed engagement. Undirected engagement produces architectural and urbanistic illiteracy. Directed non-engagement produces something terrible that nobody will engage. And a kind of directed engagement is, I think, the skill of an urbanist, is to engage people but direct, to bring a knowledge of urban history and a knowledge of urban possibility to people who are not trained to have those that kind of knowledge, but have a very different personal perspective. So I think it's a more subtle process by which a truly cosmopolitan, healthy urban condition emerges, and it's very fragile. It's really easy to screw it
Yeah,
up.
I would have to agree with you, Dan, because what I see, I guess it's all relative to what city are we talking about. I mean, the Seattles and the
absolutely.
San Franciscos of the world are really good at way ahead of a lot of other cities. And in the city of Phoenix, I'll get in trouble for this, but
But
they
you
had
don't live there anymore.
I don't live there anymore. I'm not at Arizona State anymore. So they had this comprehensive planning process that basically said, what would you like to see in your city? And so you get absolutely everything, and it's completely unworkable, unmanageable. And I think a lot of cities are doing a very poor job at bringing these two sides together, the social and the physical.
This is what Chuck brought up when he mentioned stress. I remember something which Andreas Duani, who was your colleague, talked about public participation, citizen inputs. How do you involve the community, especially in relation to charrettes and planning community practices? One of his ideas, radical at that time, I think it was maybe we do it like they do it in law, in court cases. You bring a jury of a mixed breed of people from everywhere, and then they basically decide what's going to happen in a place.
Yeah.
Is that realistic? Is that possible? Is that
well,
good?
Go ahead.
I think what we're talking about, we're just missing the continuum, the other pieces of it. So there is directed planning, and I agree we need some direction, because this issue, what is your vision for your city, goes absolutely nowhere. And the people who have the time or the interest or the trust to actually participate in that, even online, is a pretty small percentage in most cities. What I'm testing in my firm is, how do you take it beyond that? So if you do directed planning, how do you then get to a point where you can get more people at the table? And what we're finding is we can have a certain amount of public engagement throughout an entire planning process that comes to a point where, in general, everyone agrees on some specific frameworks of where things need to change, but not necessarily everything about how they need to change. And then we set up working groups and actually do what we call action kits. And that's when people come out of the woodwork, because they've seen a commitment from a city or a town that we are going to change this. This is what we're going to do. This is how you can be involved, and you actually get a say. We're going to kind of have you move forward. And at that point, it's no longer abstract. But it only works for certain
Can you
kinds of
give an
projects.
example, like a streetscape?
I'll give you an example. Bridgeport, Connecticut, we're doing the waterfront master plan, and we went through every neighborhood. We did online, we did texting from signs, very limited public engagement in Bridgeport, Connecticut, for a whole host of good reasons of why that would be limited public engagement. And some very difficult community meetings about nothing has happened before, lack of trust, in some very disadvantaged neighborhoods. Bridgeport is has many challenges right now around employment, around high property taxes. When we got to the point where we actually said, yes, Johnson's Creek needs access for a disadvantaged neighborhood that hasn't had waterfront access in years, and this other area needs it. And now we are involving some third party, Trust for Public Land, and some others, and the city is committed to cleaning up some of the illegal storage yards. When we had that meeting and said we want people to sign up to be on the working group to actually be in charge of what the waterfront pathway and access will look, people came. And I actually get chills from it, because people
that's
who
great.
would never have shown up have come, and they want, because they've been given permission
Right.
to actually act.
And so that's very interesting, because that I didn't come here to talk about my book, but that's what I come up with a whole set of tools to try and achieve that result, to take to find ways to empower people strategically, but not create an out of control situation.
Right.
I think it's almost, I think generally speaking, planning staffs need to learn to let go of a little bit, not getting to anarchy, but I'll give you an example. I champion a tool called the Urban Diary, and I try and teach people some visual literacy for an efficient way of describing what I'm doing through that process. And it's a scalable tool, blah, blah, blah. But I have seen some cities try and implement it, but take away the participatory element. And they have, for instance, not allowed the type of individuals that you described that feel a bit blessed to have a role. They've not let them take the pictures, but again, even outside, they've gone, go to this view, and you'll see 2 photos, and pick the one you like best in terms of conceptualizing the future. I think the answer's somewhere in between, and as Dan said, it's a very subtle problem, and it probably depends on who it is that's facilitating.
Well,
Yeah.
Emily's quite right
Yeah.
that places are particularly different from one another.
Yeah.
I can't imagine a place in which you need to recruit community involvement. I mean, that's unthinkable in the Bay Area or in San Francisco.
Yeah, in the Bay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the
That you
ISA
have-
problems, yeah.
that you would have to actually
Yeah.
seek people to become engaged in public process.
Before I forget, or before we forget, just to close this thing on social diversity, and I can start asking both of you, because I know you worked with this. Can we design for social diversity? Can we spatialize multiculturalism so we don't fall into the trap of spatial determinism, or is it going to be spatial enablism or
There's
probabilism?
a sign that was only up for 1 year because it was made very crudely by the tenants of a public housing project that we did in Seattle. And it's a very moving image. I maybe should have had it for my images here. It's a simple, crude 4x4 with these one by boards nailed onto it that with points on them, and they point in all directions, and they say Cambodia, Somalia, Eritrea, Thailand, and it's where the people are from. And then there's one that says Mount Rainier, and it is about being in a place where people from every place have found a home. And it happens to be a Hope 6 project. It's also mixed income. And to me, that sign is a kind of vindication of the vision behind that great public initiative. A truly cosmopolitan place, which is not the home of any of these people. It's Seattle. And the architecture and the urbanism of it is based on Seattle and their aspirations to be in Seattle. But with this dual allegiance to a place of origin and a place of arrival.
And it's interesting because a couple of I know which one you mean, and I've been down in wearing many hats, but oftentimes after the design, a couple of years later, and there's a problem with people racing cars in the public space, or the circular street around the Central Park. The resolution of issues and the governance of the place as it moves forward after the design becomes very, very interesting, because oftentimes it is those people on the association board who you would expect, and they are socially aware professionals, often white, who moved to a Hope 6 project, and a variety of people who feel confident in that role. But many of the residents, the users of a space, stand back from the government of the place and won't get involved in the ongoing resolution. So, this is where I struggle, Dan, because the design may be the most appropriate for the place, and it may have succeeded.
Mm-hmm.
But
you know what I say to
yeah.
that? That's going on in Chicago, too.
Yeah.
That's just a matter of time, I think. I think that we need time to work out how to collectively, people from very different backgrounds, how do they collectively integrate in a given neighborhood? And I think that it's so in the U.S. we have been so socially segregated, and we're getting even more so, that we don't have that great of experience of rich and poor living together and caring jointly for an environment. And so there was a big critique. A book came out of, just recently critiquing on that very point, public Hope 6 projects in Chicago. And I just felt like, come on, guys, it's only been a few years.
Yeah.
We need
Urbanism needs time
to work this out.
Yeah.
But what I worry about, back to your question, can you design for diversity?
Right.
The kind of thing that Dan is doing and the Hope 6, I think that is the least of our problems. That is fantastic that we actually have government resources supporting the integration of unit sizes and actually subsidizing some portion.
Had government resources.
Had. yeah, if we could only be so lucky to populate more of those, to have more of those programs. What I worry about is what we have thought, and this is a new kind of stream I've been thinking along, and so I would like to have reactions and critiques. Jane Jacobs' diversity dimensions, and we can talk about how she ignored race in that, but and some of the things I have written about with this book, Designed for Diversity, having the proper mix, this proper zoning that can support mix of housing types, the great public spaces, all that stuff. What that is doing is actually undermining diversity, I'm thinking lately, because those places are so popular. And you're using these design principles. Design for diversity is actually design that will undermine diversity because it will be so loved because it seems like it's a diverse place and people are sick of homogeneity. Does that make any sense to anyone? I mean, that is what's playing out in a lot of cities.
Well, it does, but it goes back to the problem, and it comes front and center when I come here to Stockholm, to Sweden, to Scandinavia, where good design is taken for granted. That and not that everything is good design, but there is an acceptance about a quality of design and a thoughtfulness and a fact that everyone deserves beauty, not just some, but everybody. And we don't have that. And so the problem is, whether it's good design for diversity or not, good design is so unusual in the United States that everyone wants to be there. And it is a problem because I hear in communities, when we're working in disadvantaged communities, there's both a longing for good design to say we are worth it, we want all of these things, but we don't want the gentrification that comes
One of
with
the
it.
most diverse places that I can think of in the Bay Area is IKEA. And you go there, everybody goes there, rich and poor, and quite poor, and consumes very sophisticated design in a completely egalitarian way. It's globalization at its best. You buy a table where the legs are made in Thailand and the top was made in Chile, and they fit together with a 32nd of an inch tolerance, and it costs a fraction of what it would cost elsewhere. So, I mean, in a way, IKEA is the apotheosis of modernism. It was the modernist dream of a mass-produced, egalitarian, technically sophisticated environment. What it doesn't do, IKEA cannot do, and the IKEA attempts at refugee housing are a vivid example of the limitations of modernist thinking to produce place. It's about things, not about places. And modernism, as exemplified by IKEA, is great at producing beautiful things and completely lost at producing great places because it comes from a different part of your brain from making things. So the egalitarian aspect of IKEA, the diversity of it, the racial, every race, every age, every big, small, all sorts of people are there, and I think that's really quite a fascinating phenomenon. And it's Swedish.
You took up the placemaking, and we're going to get into that subject a little bit, because isn't that now the all issues of equity, diversity, social justice, inclusivity, they're pretty much connected within sort of this new wave of planning, which goes under a lot of names. I tend to start with Margaret Crawford's Everyday Urbanism. We can move down to pop-up DIYs, to tactical urbanism. That sort of looks like it's spearheading the whole thing. Take things into my own hands, with the help of all of the planners, urban designers, and try to create a equitable instead of
but
large
Stockholm's
major.
got something that none of those
DIY.
little movements
DIYs,
have.
yeah. No.
It has grandeur.
Yeah.
It has civic grandeur and grace, and a kind of urban dignity that isn't pop-up, isn't tactical, isn't dinky, it's grand.
Except for the suburbs. That's a little bit different in the
curious what you
suburbs.
mean.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's all of the movements you named are a double-edged sword, because oftentimes that's the only way that some of the disenfranchised or the people who have trust issues with the process oftentimes those are the only way they're going to get involved at all, because it's on their block, or it's a rebellious intervention. They're going to put
But
in
the
a
disenfranchised are most often disenfranchised young architects.
Could be, but it's all could be. But often, and you're right. Oftentimes, the community leaders of these efforts are young architects.
Yeah.
Okay, so for whatever reason, these these are very interesting things for people to get involved with at a neighborhood level. And what I remember is the company that used to go around the country and help what we used to call yuppie couples build playgrounds for their kids. Remember, and everybody would do it for a day and then it would be built. That's fine. What I fear, and this is a different spin on what Dan just said, those things should not be ends in themselves.
That's right.
And I have seen way too many people get, as if that is urban planning, or as that is the only thing we need to do. And people have built their reputations on this stuff. And it drives me crazy because, although I'm not an architect, I tend to remember the lofty, or I'm not an architect, not a formal urban planner, I remember the lofty ideals of the city, and I cannot start now. I need to understand the precepts for the relationship of people to urban environments. And go ahead, Dan.
No, I just said the equation of inclusiveness with dinkification.
Right.
It's a new
Is that
term.
a new word?
That's a
Okay.
new word that
Dinkification.
covers all the movements.
Dinkification.
Yeah.
I like it.
It is unfortunate
Yeah.
because the heritage of urbanism is much richer and much more important than that.
Yeah, it is, and so what happens is, if you dare to bring back history to these issues, and another aspect of it is those who believe that everything will be resolved by density and small living units at the expense of single family units. This is another very populist idea, but anytime, my experience, even in a leftward-leaning city, is that anytime you want to bring in arguments like Dan has just made, that's an old white guy thing to say and do. And
it is.
Yeah, and
The discussion density, we're going to have another round table on that.
Yeah, but anyway,
Massive
so
subject, yeah.
so I have trouble because on the other hand, I can think of some people who would never have gotten involved in all of this stuff if they didn't have tactical urbanism to surround them or to embrace. On the other hand, it's an end in itself, I think.
But can parallels be drawn with sort of this, with the new generation of urbanist planners that have sort of lost confidence, like we have the new generation that has lost confidence with politics? So you take things into your own hands.
Yeah.
Same thing, sort of crisis in urban planning as a discipline, urban design, architecture, and then
I think it gets
revert
back
to this
to
one.
what Susan was saying about how people came out when they had a sense of agency, like they really were going to be able to make a difference.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
so in some respects, this whole dinkification, well, it's a loss of, urban planning, no longer providing a means of engagement in a real, purposeful way. It's kind of a breakdown in that whole translation. I see it in Chicago all the time. People don't know how. I see this lot here, it needs to be changed. How do I make that happen? If there isn't a robust neighborhood planning process in place where you are really assured of having some agency in making a difference, it's just totally broken.
That's true. I mean, I think that, taking your point and kind of marrying it with this, it's the idea that the tactical urbanist pieces become institutionalized. So maybe that's an oxymoron, but our idea of the action kits is that it's actually accepted by government, because that's really who's missing from this table, right?
Right.
Is who gives the agency. And that's important because I think that I work with a lot of very well-meaning, well-intentioned clients who just don't have a framework of experience, of bureaucracy, in order to make that happen. And so they need a little help too, because it's new for everybody. But there's a way to institutionalize that within government, or way how decisions are made. And I actually think that this message crosses party lines, right? It's about inclusivity and giving the voiceless a voice and agency. And it's also about saying government can't do it all.
I think
And
it's
that we
about
have
that.
others.
It's about all those things, but it's about a great deal more. And I always am fascinated by the difference between the first 2 years of the Obama administration and the first 2 years of FDR. When Harry Hopkins and FDR, but mainly the agency of Harry Hopkins, had a complete vision of the relationship of job creation, pulling America out of the Depression, city building, employment, and the role of government. And the accomplishments of the WPA and the Roosevelt years in American cities, which are the greatest era of city building we ever went through, compared with the scattershot, completely visionless stimulus plan, which was directed only at the banks and an economic recovery, not what you did with the money, is just a very sad fact of our time. So that all happened in a way that Obama lost the midterms in 94. Roosevelt carried the midterms in 1934, so the WPA could be built on that, because there was a vision of how the pieces of the economy, of society, WPA refused to use advanced technology in building so that it would create employment. It was deliberately retrograde technologically that the great public works of the United States were built, because they made employment. They pulled the whole country out of the Depression. And there was never that kind of unitary vision of what the role of government, what the role of capital, how public and private interacted. That has been part of our generation and our time, left and right. Left and right.
We even hoped that Trump would kind of pick up on that theme of infrastructure investment, and that is not happening, unfortunately. It probably would have been visionless too, but there was.
We'll have another roundtable about Trump.
Okay.
But
Sorry,
as
I
we're
didn't mean
running
to
sort of a
mention it.
60 minutes, CBS 60 minutes, so I want to crack open one other subject, last one. And that's, I can start from you, Chuck, because you just came up with a book that actually deals with it. And I think Robert Stoiteville, if I'm pronouncing his name right. Studeville. Robert Studeville, who was the editor of Better Cities and Towns, now he runs the Public Square blog, framed something which he took a little bit from Jane Jacobs, the observational urbanism techniques.
Right.
How do we look at the city? And I remember yesterday, Dan, Chuck, and I had a coffee and cake discussion about urbanism or observation versus research, because you had a panel on that in CNU.
The panel turned into that.
But you produced a whole book on this, basically, Chuck. It deals really very much about observational urbanism. How can we make cities? Speaking of books, I didn't show any books today, but we'll do that later. And my friend of mine, Julian Aguiman, said if you show authors' books for 40 seconds, 20% of the audience will buy them afterwards on Amazon. We have a global audience later on, not a live one, so maybe we'll show the books later. So back to your, what would you say? Do you consider this as a social science research method, observation, or is it just, a very individual thing that each and every one of us has?
I like to say about this book that it's art, science, and both. And what I try and do is go beyond the legacy urbanist observers, urban designers such as Kevin Lynch, who taught us even before Image of the City in his article with Malcolm Rivkin in 1959 that people care about what their neighborhoods look like. And he did some earlier forms of social science research to validate that. I catalog some of that, and what I really aim to do is bring observation forward, kind of acknowledge the Alexandra Horowitz and the Rebecca Solnitz and the authors who champion this along the way, and turn it into a tool that Susan and others can use in their engagement. And that's why I like to say, in my book talks that this book goes from all the way from the Parisian flaneur to Pokemon Go. And so I try and unpack what observation means. I try and help people with a scalable tool that I mentioned earlier learn how to see. And my hope is that not only people who are interested in learning more about their surroundings will embrace this, but professionals and decision makers. I mean, I wrote this book for a lot of people. I wrote this book for the neighbor who wants to understand, and I wrote this book for the elected official as well. To your point, can observation make a difference in affecting a positive change in the urban environment? I think so, because I think from a more inductive standpoint and not a social science standpoint, my osmosis through my father and my years of experience in the trenches watching people fight about stuff leads me to believe that what stuff looks like plays a really big role in all of this.
I'd like to provoke both of you.
Yeah, and so, you know, no, go ahead. But yes, I think it can make a difference, but it's not, I wouldn't argue it as a research-based
methodology,
but there's
strategy.
plenty of footnotes.
Okay.
Yeah, since they're surrounded by real researchers here, as opposed to thick-fingered working lads who just build things. Let me put forward an idea, which is that research and observation are quite different, that they each have a role, that hampering observation with the empirical apparatus of research is actually crippling to observation. In the panel that we were on in Seattle, Alan Plattis, who's director of urban design at Yale, and a very smart guy, was saying that new urbanism has devolved from research into dogma. And he cited as research three things. Mike Dennis's great book, Court and Garden, Anne Vernet's book on San Francisco, and Rem Koolhaas's Delirious New York. And I said, none of those are research. They're all observation.
Right.
And their power is in their is that they are observational, and that they're not entrapped in the rigor of empiricism.
Well, if I could quickly respond, I agree with you. And one thing that I think is really important, and it's a unifying force to everything we've been talking about. If you over-empiricize, you often lose the human element, and we are obsessed with proving Jane Jacobs was right by studies and by technological means to crowdsource a variety of data, and then we say, "See, she was right." Okay.
But she's a literary figure, not a researcher.
I know, and so we're mixing metaphors all over the place. My point is that there's a point you can make that all inputs are human, even to research or a technological solution. And so in the end, I address this point by saying, look, even if you take a coffee table photograph of a Parisian Haussmannized street, which I do, it's the cover, and it's a very purposeful cover for this reason, that is one data point when people study whether, the implications of human activity along the avenue, l'Avenue d'Opera. And so all inputs are, to an observational piece of research or to a more inductive form of observation are human.
So
Data,
I have to come to the defense of research, being at a research institution. So it seems to me observation is one method of research. Research is about answering a question. So you have a question that you are trying to get answered, and you do the research to answer that question. Now, if the observation is your qualitative method, as opposed to a quantitative method, there are certain questions you're trying to answer. So therefore, it is a form of research, I would say. So we don't want to get too mixed up in semantics, but I'm very alarmed at if I'm hearing a sort of anti-data, anti-research sort of spin on this, I have to object vehemently. I was just in the March for Science support. And so it's alarming to me that we even have to make such a case that, research is important, data is important. It's how you use it and for what purpose.
But there's science and there's scientism, which are not the same thing. And there is the worship of data. There's the encapsulating prison of data that if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. And I think that's a grave danger.
That's a danger. Sure.
There was a very interesting article because I knew you were involved in this exchange of when Stephen Marshall from UCL published an article, Is Urban Design Pseudoscience? And there was a lot of rejoinders after that. But recently came an article by Kim Dovey and Pafka about that we should, looking at the contribution of people like Christopher Alexander, Jane Jacobs, William White, those that observed what kind of qualitative sort of data, in a sense, they have accumulated. So their value in research, as part of research. So it's sort of, as, on your line, it's important element when we do social science research. Data as observational methods, but we don't really have a methodology that we can call observational urbanism, like we have grounded theory. We don't have a specific set of rules that we need to follow.
Well, I think people get alarmed, maybe like Dan, if there's the underlying values are not being exposed. So we don't really know what's the value system here. And that's a big problem in big data and data science, which is a very big deal at a lot of institutions right now because it can be monetized, I think, is the real reason. But and you do see a lot of people struggling with, we have all this data for urbanism, but what are we doing with it? And I've seen a lot of conversations about trying to find like data in search of a purpose, and it is very frustrating.
In search of a question.
In search of
a question, yeah.
Search of a question, yeah.
So I have something here now because we're nearing to the end, and it's not any kind of diplomas for you. On the contrary, we decided to do something because I think this was an inspiration from a colleague of mine. There was a very interesting program in Swedish television called The World of Ideas, where they probed into different questions from feminism to globalization. And at the end, Eric Schultz asked the participants, the guests, to bring an important photograph to them. Something that has meaning, something that is. So I asked each and every one of you to bring a photo, and that
so
will
we're
sort
using
of
our powers of observation.
Yeah, I'm looking at Chuck now to sort of say something about what the photo means, and especially in this conversation, I think I'll start from. This is something what Dan has brought.
Is it the others who would comment on this, or should I comment?
Well, we can point it to our colleagues.
Why don't you start?
Yeah.
Why don't we start with the colleagues. Do you want to show the image?
I think here we have one for the audience.
Yeah, tragedy. Just really, I don't even. The words can't even describe. I'm saddened by that picture, and I think it's become so common in cities like San Francisco and Seattle and even in Chicago and all over the place that we're all getting desensitized. We're all just literally stepping over bodies in the street.
Right.
I'm struck when you talk about you can't imagine a project where people wouldn't come to participate.
When this is
the project. Who are we leaving out? Who are we planning for? That's what I think of when we see that picture.
I use photos like this a lot in not my legal work, but in my scholarly work. And that's to show exactly what you're showing, that we have conditioned reactions to these types of photos. In my book, I have a nicely placed photo, or a photo of a nicely placed homeless tent in Seattle with a spectacular view in a public park, designed to stimulate people to realize what their knee-jerk reactions are to the right of that person to be using that space. So I look at this, and there's the human response, but then there's what do we do about this response, and are we ever going to be able to solve, as design, planning, land use professionals, whatever this group is, are we ever going to be able to solve this type of thing?
This
Well,
is a perfect example
Yeah.
where DIY and tactical is not going to do anything,
Right.
and where we need our big government vision response, I think.
I think this one is yours.
This is mine.
Yep.
A little more hopeful.
A hopeful. Here we go.
Just took that last week in Rockridge.
Well, you took it in Berkeley, for God's sakes. I mean, of course.
What I wanted, am
It's
I
a
allowed
hopeful
to
one.
comment
Yeah,
on my
yeah,
own?
absolutely.
To me, this is the
Absolutely.
role of retail, the role of small business, the role of that small independent bookseller who is free to who really does have a an economic reason to be inclusive, and I think that retail, the death of small independent retail, is something that I'm really alarmed about.
No, I think it's a great photograph for a couple reasons. One is the ostensible subject matter, the poster in the bookstore. But more interestingly is what you see through the storefront and the street beyond, the scale of that street, the whole sense of community and townscape that supports this bookstore and that sign in this place.
Everyone is welcome here. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that
Yeah.
it is.
What Dan said.
All right.
Yeah, I think it's really nice.
Mhm.
Yeah.
The overlays are. So what we're doing here is what I hope everyone does. This is what my hope, to get everyone out, whoever everyone is, to do this kind of thing. But I think the opportunity to look at the issues presented in one shot is fascinating, and you have a pretty nice facade back there through the window as well, clearly in an urban environment.
And an
Great.
open door,
Yeah.
literally.
Yeah.
Open door,
Now,
literally.
if you wanted to put a negative spin on that, you could say, have we really gotten to the point where we have to have such signs? You know,
Yes.
that we have to advertise that.
And what the role of words versus the role, yeah.
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 Okay.
You know, another thing
Oh.
interesting about this is
Sure.
the incivility of the word of the sign that says "push" on the door. I remember, being in London and seeing a sign that said, didn't say push, it said to summon the lift, press the button firmly.
Ah,
And
it's very elegant. Yeah. Okay. Then we have number 3.
Idiots, in other words.
This is Susan's. Yeah, you can start, Susan.
This is Bridgeport, and this is a waterfront that's actually quite beautiful beyond the barbed wire, and the fence, and the communities that have no access on this side, and the water on the other. And for me, it's encompasses pretty much everything about planning and placemaking. Who are we making a place for? How do we make a place at the table for them to be involved and to act?
Yeah, you also have the
Powerful.
historic, I think you have the historic uses
Right.
contrasting with,
Right.
maybe an old industrial, so it's the time transition, and how are we, yeah, that's another great one.
Frank Bruni in yesterday's New York Times wrote about Rome, and it was a very troubling article about Rome. How corporate interests are doing magnificent restorations of Roman monuments, while the fabric of Rome is turned into weeds and garbage
Right.
through just civic mess. And I think this is that same kind of image. On the one hand, this beautiful fabric of historic remnants, don't know what they are, a pretty crude modern building behind, and then a dereliction of the public realm.
It's in many ways kind of a violent, upsetting image with this sort of barbed wire, Gestapo look here.
As Jim Conster would say, to keep the inmates inside, not to reach
Yeah,
in
it's
there.
That's great.
Yeah. And then we have one last, and that's yours, Chuck. I'll just put one here, and then Chuck will pass it around. Yeah.
So I wanted to provide a townscape that encompasses the potentials or perhaps the results of what we would call density. I use this photo to, in the middle of my talk, to draw out people with regard to what they see. And then I end up telling them, did you know? I ask them, where is this? And nobody knows because it's in Malta, 60 miles south of Sicily, the island country of Malta, which is in the EU. I draw them through the individual elements, transportation, color, everything we see in a city, human. I hate the word vibrant, but you see the vibrant activity down in the lower left-hand corner. You see different housing types. You see what looks like 1962 New York wedding cake zoning. And then I say, do you know that this is the densest portion of Europe? And then I invite a dialogue about what density means to them, and it helps draw out that density is not necessarily a solution, or maybe if appropriately implemented, density can be pretty exciting. And that's how it's used. It does not have, there's not much social justice in that photo unless you want to look at some of the structures in the distance. And
Well, you have nature as a part of it.
Yeah.
To
Yes.
imagine this as an illustration for Emily's book, Landscape Architecture and Its Discontents, with the new urbanists and the landscape urbanists
Joining
quarreling for ownership of this image. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, I kind of want to see what's going on behind these buildings. Once you get off this magnificent, lit up, fun festival atmosphere, what's going on behind? That would be my...
That's the next one. And I didn't bring any I did bring one photo just to close this off.
Oh,
and of
gosh.
course it's the Oracle in Delphi. And I hope we have gone deep into the questions of urbanism. At least we have scratched the surface, but with a wonderful panel. And I would like to thank our guests that came all the way from the four corners of the U.S. Chuck Wolfe from Seattle, Susan Silberberg from Boston, Emily Talen from Chicago, and Daniel Solomon from San Francisco. With that, I would like to wrap this up. My name is Tigran Haas, and you have been listening to the Delphi Conversations at KTH. We'll see you soon.